In this video, we'll look at how to apply the perspective drawing skills we have acquired to other more advanced fields of drawing. We'll look at how to draw an existing subject using reference and from imagination by drawing the human head, and then we'll look at how to come up with a completely imagined object by drawing a mech. This will hopefully cap off the perspective drawing notes that I've shared, show how I use the various things that we covered in those videos, and see how I apply them and think about them when working on my everyday studies. If you like the format of this video, please let me know, as it's something I'm considering doing more of. They don't take too long to make and would allow me to share the things I think about and work on for specific study sessions. Let's start with the human head. If you wanted to go about applying your perspective skills to something like this, you first need to study it. You cannot draw what you do not understand, and so when I encounter something new that I want to draw eventually from imagination, I try and find a good breakdown of it into simpler forms which will be easier for me to draw in perspective. My favourite resource for this is the book Drawing Form and Pose by Tom Fox, which does this very well. It starts by explaining the box proportions required for the head, and then builds detail up to the planar level before finally adding a lot more refined detail for things like the facial features. This is roughly the route I follow, as you'll see, and the more you do it, the faster you get. The key thing to note though is that it all starts with a simple form drawn in perspective. I apply this same logic to drawing cars or anything else. Study a subject and break it down into the simplest primitive shapes, then detail it up gradually. We covered how to do this in the videos on sculpting and carving. Try to see how I pass through the stages of drawing a box, making it more planar, and then adding details. One more thing I'll show here is a new addition to my study tools, which is this little anatomical skull that I got from Amazon. This is another form of studying my subject. It's way easier to work from reference before jumping into imagination, and what better reference than having the real thing in front of you in 3D. I'm going to use this model here just to show some ways that you can combine reference with the perspective skills you have learned so far, and then I'll put the model down and do the rest without it, working from my imagination. Because I understand the general proportions and form of the head, I don't really need this skull model, but it's useful for learning the parts that I'm still quite new at, such as the curvature and also specific anatomy of things like the cheekbones and eye sockets. You can see that I've started here by drawing in a horizon line, and also by establishing the left vanishing point, which is actually off the page for this drawing. I'm also converging the vertical lines downwards slightly, which is something that I do automatically now. I've only just noticed this as I've rewatched this footage, but I always draw in 3-point perspective by default. It's ingrained into my nervous system pretty much. The eyes of this skull will be roughly at eye level, and because more of the skull is below the eyes, then we're ever so slightly above the skull, and the verticals will therefore converge downwards. It will be very slight though, and I haven't even bothered to mark a vanishing point for this as it would be so far off the bottom of the page. I'm starting by literally drawing a box, but it's a box that would fit around this skull model, and that's because the first thing to do, besides deciding on your eye level, view angle, and all the perspective related stuff, is to figure out the proportions of the subject. If I get this wrong, then the skull will feel incorrect and look derpy, no matter how good I might draw it. I think this is something that many beginner artists mess up, whether drawing cars or human figures or even furniture. The proportions, sometimes called the envelope or containing volume, account for a huge percentage of likeness and realism. Distorting this can be done intentionally to make something look weird or cartoony, but here I want it fairly realistic and correct if possible. I'm using a grey marker pen here just so that what I'm doing shows up on camera a bit better. I do use these to draw and plan my workout, but I always use the faintest grey marker I have. This darker one is used to help you see the work I'm doing. I'm dividing the box up into thirds vertically, and this comes from Tom Fox, and it's a fairly standard way to map a head into a box. The idea is that the top third line is the eyes, and the lower third one is for the jaw joint. This means that the rounded bulbous part of the skull can then occupy the upper 2/3, and the jaw can occupy the lower third, which is pretty accurate for most humans. We can then divide with a vertical line exactly halfway, and the bottom rear corner section will be empty space. It's where the neck might be, but it's not part of the actual skull. When I draw the head in like this, it's got no curves and it needs the corners and edges chopped back a fair bit to make it feel more real. This gives the very basic planes and angles of the head. I can now place the curve lines. I'm drawing arcs between 2 points, with a midpoint that I want to pass through. This is to really help me begin to see this as three-dimensional, and I'm thinking of it as a ghost here, a see-through form that I am drawing inside. The top curve passes from ear to ear and touches the hairline, which is a curve line that Loomis uses to plan his head drawings and a useful landmark. We then have another curve for the jaw, which works in the exact same way but passes through the chin tip. I can then use my knowledge of the skull, or my model in this case, to try and nail the silhouette at the far side of the head and begin to sculpt this box to the more familiar skull shape. This entire process just involves using lines either inside the ghost form or on the surface, which we call contour lines, to gradually build up the forms of the head. I can remove a chunk of material for the brow and cheek planes and place a smaller ellipse or curved line for the mouth to map to. These are very easy things that you can add to very quickly build the head up into something recognizable. I generally start with the brows and what we call the glabellum, which is the bit where the nose and brow meet. And this is because it allows me to figure out the center line of the head as well as the way the brow wraps around. My skull model actually has quite a square brow, squarer than the curves that I have been drawing for it up until now, and so that was something that caught my attention while doing this. These sorts of things can be considered as variables and played with to make different characters. I might make the brow very square or very round, and these traits can make your heads appear more masculine or feminine or good or evil looking. As I become more skilled, I hope to have much more control over these variables, but for today, they're not my focus. One key thing that curvature and perspective combined can cause is the far eye to be physically smaller in appearance than the nearer one. You can see this in the eye sockets here. This works in the exact same way as the degree of the ellipses that we drew together. As we look more edge on to the ellipse, it narrows, and the curving away of the distant part of the head causes this effect on the eye socket. With the skull finished, I can start adding some basic anatomy, and I start with the ears for no particular reason. I've never really studied ears, and so these are probably wrong, but I can get them somewhat respectable. This is a great thing to study in perspective because the ears are like flat planes that need to project from the head at an angle. You may also need to mirror this plane across depending on the view angle. You'll see that for lines like the eyebrows, I'm now thinking about drawing on the surface of the skull as if it were a real object, like my model here. I think that's such an important point to make. I jump between seeing the see-through ghost version of the head and the real solid version as I work on this, and it takes a while to develop that. Eyes and noses and stuff I once again have never studied in any real detail, but I can use my understanding of proportion and this mapped out form I've created to accurately place the features, and that's most of the work done. I could make the eyes dots and the mouth a simple line, but because I've placed them more or less accurately, the end result will be more believable. The eye shapes get drawn as if there are spheres in the eye sockets now, so I'm drawing on the surface of small balls as if they were solid objects. This helps the eyes look more volumetric and not as flat, stuck-on shapes, which is another mistake that I've seen many artists make. I know what lines to add to build the eyes up from studying barg drawing, but they're likely incorrect as remember I've never really studied eye anatomy. As I go through, I have a small checklist of things memorized. For example, the corners of the mouth are generally directly below the center of the eyeballs, and this makes it easy for me to find the position of the mouth from any perspective angle, because we're just extending lines in perspective. My method of constructing heads could be summarized as a checklist of things that's growing all the time. I'm constantly adding to it, working the individual steps and adding more as I learn them. Over time, they become ingrained, and I don't even stop to think about them. When I draw in the top silhouette of the cranium, you'll see that I break away from my grey underdrawing and change the silhouette, and that's because I felt the drawing was wrong at this point and needed fixing. I don't ever stick to the underdrawing or scaffold as if it was totally correct. I allow the head and face to change and adapt as the overall image develops. The neck is a cylinder, and you can see I cap it off with a partial ellipse, hopefully rotated to the correct angle in the correct perspective. With the second head, I work much faster, but I'm trying to use the same perspective framework. However, this head is further away, and so it will be smaller, and I'm rotating the starting box so that we see more of the side of the head. Using my grey water brush pen, which is just grey ink and water, you can see how quickly I can run through my mental checklist. I can fit this form into perspective really fast, and that's down to repetition and understanding of the proportions I want this box to have. Overlap is something I've spoken about a lot, and for perspective, it's your best friend. If I can make the nose look like it overlaps the far eye, then your brain will just accept this as a three-dimensional object, and it's a really core aspect of drawing in perspective. That being said, watching this one back, I don't think I got enough curvature on the face here. It's important to spot your mistakes, and every drawing is full of them no matter how good you ever get. That's how we continue to learn throughout our lives as artists. Another checklist item for ear placement is that the ears fit exactly in between the eyes and nose. You can trace lines around the head as contours from these features to find the height of the ears for your character. Some people draw the ears too low down or too high up, and so that's a simple one to fix. Note how, because we're seeing this head more side on to the last one, the back of the skull is not behind the ear like it was before. That's another example of overlap. I also thought I'd try and add some basic rendering to this head based on the light coming from the right towards where the vanishing point is. That would make all of the stuff on this nearest side of the head facing us be more or less in shadow. This too requires you to think in perspective and really see the drawing as a solid sculpture or object to plot where the shadows would get cast. It's not something we've touched on in the videos, but it's really just an extension of what you already know and understanding the mechanics of how light works. The Scott Robertson follow-up book, How to Render, is what I would recommend for learning this, but you do have to be fairly good at drawing in perspective to actually be able to render things, and that's another reason why I push perspective so much as a fundamental skill. The next head, I think, is the one that I liked the best. When I draw a page of heads like this, I dislike most of them. I still cannot draw things as good as I want, but every perhaps 1 in 10 come out as I want them to. The perspective on this head is actually a little different to the lines and points that I used for the previous one, but it's not too far off it. I drew this without thinking too much about the previous perspective points. I just wanted to make a head that was facing us from the other side. You can hopefully see how it's constructed of curves and planes and contours, all gradually building up the form and volume. I'm not using the skull model now, and so all of this stuff I'm doing is learned through many hours of specific, focused practice, and it's still not perfect. I placed a lot fewer construction lines this time compared to the last one, and I did this because I wanted to ink those features on and push them a little more. You can see how I'm angling the eyebrows and making the nose a little pointier, thinking about how I can use those variables a bit more now. How can I adjust the knowledge I have just a little bit to make the face look different? It might go well, it might go terribly, but I'm never afraid to experiment. These are not finished drawings. I don't care about posting them on social media or anything like that. I just draw them quickly to test stuff out and then move on to the next one. I felt that this one actually felt the most like something you might see in a manga, and I can see I even did things on the far side of the head like leave broken ends on the lines. That's something that Tom Fox talks about a lot, and you see it sometimes in Japanese comics. There's this gap between the cheek and the eye, which is clearly not realistic, but it helps different parts of the drawing remain separated and makes them easier to understand. We also have some overlap on this one, where the mass of the lips feels like it's protruding out far enough to cover the silhouette of the far side of the cheek there. I also leave some more broken lines under the jaw, and that's another point that I play with. I don't really have full control of it yet, but there are times when not drawing a line can be more powerful than drawing it. Particularly for more feminine characters, you sometimes want to de-emphasize certain lines. I've done that here just to see what happens. The ear is huge, but it's okay because this did come out as more of a cartoony character. As I render this one, I'm really thinking about the planes of the head and making my lines follow those planes at an angle to give them a slightly more curved feel, and also, once again, everything is in perspective. I'm thinking about how these lines I'm hatching in must follow the form of the head, which is in perspective. The final head I tried using more of a Loomis-based approach and drew a cylinder and ball to represent the cranium and build out from that. Every single one of these is pretty much the same routine. I just place a box or similar shape with the correct proportions in perspective, map the subdivide planar head form onto that box, and then add details based on my checklist of understood points. The cool thing that kicks it all off though is this box in perspective. If I just started off right away drawing an eye, then the final head would come out all over the place. However, this is how an artist like Kim Jung-gi might draw it. One of the things I'm always looking at is how he was able to draw like that and why I can't draw like that. I think the answer is again just familiarity. I can draw an ellipse for the neck here pretty well as a freehand pen line and see the ghost ellipse it needs to follow in my mind. I think part of what Kim Jung-gi did was accurately build out forms based on the lines he had already placed down on the page. I didn't like this drawing as much. I tried to make the character a bit more feminine by changing the features again, and it went wrong and didn't work. But that's fine. It happens. And like I said, maybe every 1 in 10 of these comes out any good. Remember, the key takeaway is that while this is clearly more advanced and concerned with things like facial anatomy and head proportion, you can see that I could not even really begin studying or talking about that stuff unless I understood how to rotate boxes. And rotating boxes requires perspective drawing skills. Because I don't have to stop and think about perspective, I can do this on autopilot and work more on the things I care about improving at, like drawing good heads. I often liken this to spinning plates. If you want to draw heads in perspective and you can't do perspective yet, then you'll be spinning too many plates at once and fail. But if you spin just the perspective plate, as we've been practicing, then once you can spin the plate without any conscious effort, you can run that process in the background and get it right most of the time, which frees up RAM in your brain to work on the next thing. If you try and work too much at once, you just collapse, and I still make that mistake all the time. We want focused and narrow study sessions with a specific outcome in mind. Get your perspective skills up to a certain standard, then apply them to a subject you wish to study. Every line will be more accurate, and this will lead to better drawings and more believable forms. Let's draw a mech next. This was a challenge on the world's biggest art learning experiment Discord server, and I wanted to try and draw something different to my usual mech stuff. I started by looking at literally the first handful of images that come up on Pinterest, just to get some rough ideas. I'll put these away once I start drawing so that I don't copy them, but if I get stuck I can always quickly open them up and look at them again to generate an original idea inspired by them. This is different to the head that we drew before, because while there are many mech drawings out there in the world, I want to make my own. And this means I have to decide roughly how I want this thing to look and how it will be laid out before I start. I know I want it to be bipedal, and I know I want the legs to bend backwards, so it's not that different to drawing a person. I start with drawing a basic skeleton or gesture for the mech, and then flesh that out into primitive forms and finally detail it. This is harder because there's no reference, and so it uses different art muscles. If you want to rely more heavily on reference, that will be an easier way to bridge into this subject, just as we saw previously with the human heads we just did. If I'm trying to ideate quickly, I actually often produce a quick thumbnail study off to one side just to get some ideas down as fast as possible and see what issues I might encounter on the bigger drawing. I like working like this because it's almost like doing a speed run of the drawing I'm about to produce and highlights what needs designing, and if I'm going to make any mistakes in the perspective here, I can hopefully correct them for the final drawing. I wanted something humanoid with different proportions to what I usually do and to use different shapes, perhaps something more cylindrical than box-based this time. I also wanted to bend the legs back like the little thumbnail shows here. The perspective for the final drawing is pretty simple. I have an imagined vanishing point, and I just fire some lines to at intervals exactly the same as we saw when we discussed brewer grids, but with no measuring. If this were a more finished sketch, I might take a lot more care here, but I like working fast, getting my drawings done, and then moving on to the next one. While this is only a little bit of a perspective setup, from this point everything I draw here will be bearing these frameworks in mind. Everything will have to conform to the lines I've put down here. Articulation makes this a little bit more difficult. That is, the arms and legs of the mech could be positioned in a way which are aligned to a different perspective grid, and that's why I just imagine the perspective as I work. I could always use a mannequin or toy or something to help me with this positioning and how it affects things, but I'm going to use my knowledge alone here. I sketch out the legs very fast, as if they were lines or planes, and I'm thinking about them as if they were real legs, but kind of imagining the line that would run through the center of them, like a slice, the same as we saw in the videos. This allows me to quickly get them mapped out so that I can begin fleshing them out into 3 dimensions and then add detail last of all. Everything is just planes and intersected boxes, but there is one caveat to making mechs that I failed at a bit here, which is that every intersection requires articulation. You'll see once I start drawing parts like the knees that this mech probably wouldn't actually work very well in real life, but that's something that needn't matter much here if you're focusing on drawing in perspective and not on drawing highly accurate mechanical parts. Try and see how I am in ghost mode at the moment. I'm drawing whole volumes and cramming them into one another to make something as a starting form, a lot like playing with Lego or building blocks. For the head, I wanted to try and make something kind of bird-like, possibly inspired by ancient Egypt. No reason in particular, I just felt like this was where my mind was going, so I went with it. I wanted to give it some kind of crests like wings off to the side of the head and mirror them accurately in perspective. I really used to love Gundam as a kid, and so I suppose this was inspired by the crests they always had on their heads. I also wanted to work with forms I would never normally use for the upper body and make it more curved and cylindrical than the lower body just as an experiment. I think the end result was a little bit mismatched, but as I said before, just do it, see what happens, and learn from your mistakes. After fleshing out the basic forms, I can add more refined forms, and I want to do this in ballpoint pen. I started out by testing some of these out on the little guy up in the corner. For that one, I played with the idea of a frail skeleton clad with perhaps these panels or armor pieces with wires hanging out here and there to suggest something maybe not quite finished, but I changed this for the final drawing. You can see the bird theme in the feet design as well. I also wanted it to have large shoulder pad looking things, but I ended up changing this a little bit. The final design was a bit more organic. I start with the head because I felt that this might influence the rest of the design as I work, and it's important to note that I do not have anything fixed in my mind here. I'm making this up as I go along. In perspective terms, I start with a centerline plane and then I flesh out either side of it, helping me to quickly establish the volume of this head. You can hopefully see the bird-like design that I was toying with, but that's the only thing I know I really wanted at this point. I drew the winged parts closest to us first and then mirrored them across using the techniques from the mirroring video to try and get them placed and scaled accurately in perspective. I'm now thinking more in contour mode and treating this all as a solid object and wrapping lines across the head to help me place other elements on it, like this eye opening. I remember reading somewhere that breaking symmetry is important for design, so I added aerials or antenna on one side of the head only. These shoulder pad parts I actually drew as silhouettes, and I didn't flesh them out, but please understand that I was still very much thinking about the perspective that they would be placed in as I drew them. This is also another example of overlap. If I can make these shoulder parts look like they fit over the arms, like armor panels, they'll be more likely to be believed as a real 3D object. To help this further along, I add some basic cast shadows and panel lines that wrap around the forms, reinforcing the volumes as contours. Areas like the chest plate are quite different to what I would normally draw, and they're a bit more of a challenge. I tend to gravitate more towards boxes, and so working on much more curved and organic surfaces was a fun yet challenging switch up. I was trying to treat these parts as armor plates over some sort of internal frame, and planning roughly where the breaks would be for more articulation to make things feel a bit more mechanically sound. I think of these drawings currently in terms of a creation cycle, as primary, secondary, and tertiary phases. The primary phase involves finding the biggest shapes, and then in the secondary phase, I chop them up, subdivide them, and design them to make them into something more sensible. The final tertiary phase is just adding more detail and visual interest to what has now been established in the form of things like panel lines or bolts, openings, vents, stuff like that. A lot of these require mirroring across. The other thing worth mentioning is that I draw from front to back, but only when inking with the final lines. When drawing ghost forms in perspective, I can work however I want because everything is visible all at once. But once you start refining, you have to consider overlap and which parts will sit in front of the others and draw them in that order. I also played with line weight here a bit to help bring the closest parts of the edges to us with a thicker line. To help with even more overlap and fill in the blank space behind the mech, I wanted to add some sort of jets or boosters. In terms of making parts like the elbows look more mechanical, I haven't got anything I can really call upon because I've never studied anything specifically like this, so I just treat them as simple 3D primitives. I think of a cylinder representing the hinge aspect of the joint, and I add some basic details. For the forearms and hands, I was again thinking about armor and the rough volume that these would occupy on a human. For every part, the perspective is always being considered, and a mech like this is tough because while the unit as a whole fits to that grid I roughly established at the beginning, as mentioned, the 3D rotated parts like the arms and hands have their own perspective framework that I would need to adhere to. Every single finger I'm treating as a little box and trying to get the perspective right. The feet and legs were actually quite hard to do, and you'll see if you look closely that the perspective is actually slightly skewed. The feet were wedge-shaped, but the bottom, being flat, needs to feel like it actually sits on the ground, as if it were really in perspective, and then the farther back foot needs to feel like it's sat on this same floor plane, but further away from us, meaning we'll see more of the side of it. The knees were a bit of an afterthought because I realised that they wouldn't work mechanically, so I just hinted at some sort of weird joint. It's probably worth noting that I drew this front leg behind the hand, and that's overlap in use again. I tried to give the armor panels a little thickness, and this is treated as another contour line, and I actually think it helps the pieces feel more solid and volumetric, and it's a lot of fun to draw. Creating the far arm and leg is not actually mirroring this time, as these parts are not symmetrical but posed differently. This represents a slightly different perspective challenge, but to me it's actually easier because I'm just repeating the forms I've already drawn once in a new position, and because I understand perspective, I can rotate the legs to a new spot like this fairly easily. I have to change this from the grey marker pen framework I drew before, because as the drawing solidifies, I have to make the perspective work based on the other parts I've already drawn, and that causes me to have to adapt and update other parts as I draw them. One more error I made here is I forgot to draw the elbow screw on the right arm. It can be hard to make things like arms feel like they are the same length, because the farther forms will be slightly smaller depending on the view angle chosen. Ignoring all the obvious flaws with the design though, hopefully the finished mech feels like a real object in perspective, and you can hopefully see how I only really lay down some very mild parts to get me started. Most of the perspective stuff from the Scott Robertson book is still there, but I see it on the page instead of drawing it, as if it were invisible. I don't have to draw it out anymore, same as we saw on the heads. It did take me a while to get to that point, perhaps around 4 to 6 months, and yet because I'm using this every day now when I draw, it's always being reinforced and worked on all the time. Having perspective under your belt makes it possible to draw anything, from any angle, which is why I love it so much, but it is hard and it can be boring to work on. Hopefully you've seen from the videos though that there are different ways to study it, from life and books and imagination, and I suggest finding what works best for you and going with that. Have a think about what you want to draw now if you're confident with perspective, and how you can study the subject. I now treat this as a process of understanding, observation, imagination. I start by understanding the subject as well as I can, how it's made or proportioned, and all of the parts. Once I feel I understand it, I observe it. I draw it from reference if possible, and I use the reference to help me place it properly in perspective. I can then gradually deviate from observation to imagination, and I like to do this by drawing a reference from an imagined camera angle, which forces me to rotate the reference in my head. You might also try swapping parts out, such as drawing a mech with different arms or legs to the reference. Finally, try and draw the subject from imagination using your knowledge and understanding. Remember the checklist I said I have for heads? Well, that's one example of how you might go about this, but I think the best way is to just have such an intuitive understanding of your subject that you can tell when it looks wrong. I'll have some more videos delving deeper into this concept of UOI in the future, but for now that should be a taster to get you started. Thanks so much for making it to the end of this video series. As mentioned in another video, this was all part of experimenting with using teaching as a learning method, and I'll have a video out on this so-called protege effect in the next month or so. I'll try and make more videos like this in the future, and possibly more Anki decks too, once I feel competent enough to teach something else. In the meantime, I wish you the very best of luck with all your studies, and remember that the Discord server is always available if you want to study with others just like you who are looking to self-improve. See you next time.